Hi everyone, welcome to our another edition of Battlefield Tours with Rob Woolsey. Today's edition is the Rhineland Campaign Operation Blockbuster. With the slow and costly progress of Operation Variable, a new operation was planned in the drive to clear the southern bank of the Rhine. The 2nd Canadian Infantry and the 4th Canadian Armed Divisions take over and fight into Germany. Thank you for joining us as we follow the 1st Canadian Army to the Rhine. I'll let Rob take over. Enjoy and see you soon.
Thank you, Mickey. Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Rob Woolsey. I'm a member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides and happen to run Woolsey's War Walk, which is a battlefield tour guide company. And I lived in Germany for 4 years with my regular force service spouse. So what we're going to be talking about today is Operation Blockbuster, the Rhineland Campaign Part 2, which is an incredible battle and is actually one of Canada's bloodiest battles of the Second World War. So Military Family Services is not affiliated with any of the companies, apps, or products that I'm going to talk about, and they do not sponsor, do not support in any shape or way or endorse anything that I talk about. These are companies and places that I use, and I'm suggesting to you as a guide with a great deal of experience guiding these battlefields. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to go through an overview of today. We're going to talk about some recommended preparations, travel advisories, some helpful words. We're going to talk about what Operation Blockbuster was planned to be, the overview of Operation Blockbuster. We're going to talk about the attack going in, which starts the 26th of February, 1945, which turns out to be Canada's bloodiest day of the Second World War. Then we're going to talk about a place called the Hochwald Gap, which in Canadian military history is probably one of the worst fights we've ever actually had. And then we're going to talk about finally breaking the German defenses and ending the battle and clearing the western bank of the Rhine. And then we're going to talk about the commemoration of the fallen in this battle because there's kind of a unique situation. So the photo in this one is of the 1st Canadian Rocket Battery. That is something called land mattress. It's an absolutely terrifying weapon that the Allies came late to the rocket game for artillery. The Russians used it, the Germans liked it. It wasn't a big thing. So they had them for aircraft and they had them for naval vessels, but on land, it was slower to develop. And so they basically took the rocket motor from an aircraft 3-inch rocket, put a 5-inch naval warhead on the end of the rocket with a dangerously unstable fuse, and that's the official history's term of it, and then strapped it into 32 or 64 tube launchers. And each one of those land mattress rockets, when they fired the salvo out of the launcher, was equivalent to shooting an entire regiment of medium artillery firing a full barrage. And that was in one shot. So imagine that's how much firepower these things delivered. They were quite terrifying. All right, where are we talking about? We're actually talking about Germany. It's one of the few times in the Second World War that Canada actually fights inside of Germany. Interesting point of note, the very first Canadian soldier to actually fight on German soil fought at Geilenkirchen in November of 1944 in Operation Clipper, which is kind of a little thing. He was a Canadian can loan officer, so a Canadian infantry officer on loan to a British infantry battalion, and he was the very first one to fight actually inside of Germany. But now, after Operation Veritable, we get into Germany, and we're actually now going to be talking about this entire battle actually takes place inside of Germany. The area of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is where the battle takes place in the very northern part of it, is 18,152,499 as of January of last year. Or, sorry, January of 2023. Wrong year. Of course, they speak German. The two main airports closest to this battlefield inside of Germany, of course, is Dusseldorf, and the other is Wies, which actually, interesting point about Wies, was an advanced landing ground for 2nd Tactical Air Force, later became a Royal Air Force base in the Cold War. And you can still, as you drive into it, you can see all of the remains of the old RAF base. And it looks remarkably like the Geilenkirchen AWACS base. This area has been known since Roman times, and then it was under the Franks, and then it became part of the Kingdom of Germany and under the control of either the city of Cologne or Cleve at different times, and then it fell under Prussian control. It housed an ammunition factory in the Second World War for the Luftwaffe, and that was heavily damaged during the strategic bombing campaign. There was actually one near Xanten. Germany is the 9th most expensive country in the world, so it's fairly, or in Europe, so it's kind of high. for Europe, but I mean, it could be worse. Cool fact, Xanten, which is one of the objectives of the battle, was known for its archaeological park being one of the biggest in the world. The battlefield itself has not changed much, but many of the hamlets and towns have been amalgamated into bigger cities, which makes it sometimes hard to find where you're going. And the Canadians who fell in this battle are mostly buried in the Netherlands at Groesbeek Canadian War Cemetery. And that's part of that interesting commemoration piece we're going to talk about later. So, what's the weather like? Well, North Rhine-Westphalia has relatively mild climate. It's got cooler, wet winters. You guys get more rain than snow, and they're usually warm, dry summers. They're not hot, but they're quite comfortable. The ground is quite wet a lot of the time because there is a lot of water around from the Rhine River and the tributaries feeding it. The season of travel is from the end of April really to the beginning, or end of April to the end of October. I have traveled it off season. It is miserable. I do not recommend it. Always have a rain jacket when you're in that part of the world. It's a good windbreaker. And you also want really good footwear because in this case, you're going to be actually doing some, if you're going to walk this battlefield, you're actually going to be walking through some forests and trails in national forests and national spaces and farmland and farm trails that aren't paved, even to this day. Always have medical insurance when you travel. It's very important. Hospitals are at Cleve, Xanten, Dusseldorf. So there's medical facilities around. And anything, all the memorials and most places are quite child and pet friendly. But just remember, if you do see any memorials, that's exactly what they are. They are kind of sacred to some people and most people. So always check government of Canada travel advice for going to Germany. It is always important when you travel. Of course, there's no COVID restrictions anymore. There is no visa requirement from EU countries, but there is a maximum 90-day stay from Canada. Petty crime is always a risk in this area, but generally this part of Germany is really quite safe. I've never had any problems in there. As I said, there's hospitals also at Sonsbeck and Xanten. They're the two real closest. Emergency, of course, is 112 for Europe. Although 911 will work, it'll route you. It's an interesting international fact that 112 and 911 will work anywhere in the world. And of course, the closest consulate to this battlefield is in Dusseldorf. So, Operation Blockbuster overview. So this is the main map from the official history, and they actually give the dates of 22 Feb to 10 March because there's some cleanup actions between Operation Veritable and Operation Blockbuster. And it's Operation Blockbuster is really the continuation of the drive to the Rhine by the 1st Canadian Army, and is also considered some of the hardest fighting in Northwest European campaign. And that's from the participants themselves. If you read any actions or any history on it, this battle is really quite a brutal fight. It's also the very first battle where Canadian conscripts are used in the Second World War. There's one or two mentions of some coming earlier in Operation Veritable, but they actually were guys that had been conscripted and then volunteered. I did some research into the names that I had been given. But yeah, this is the first one where the conscripts, the 16,000 that Mackenzie King had sent in December of 1944 to Europe, were first coming to the battlefield. So by the 21st of February 1945, the 1st Canadian Army under General Harry Couillard had advanced about 20 miles from Nijmegen to Goch, through and over some of the worst ground and conditions experienced in Northwest Europe during the Second World War, and at a cost of about 15,000 casualties. And that's both Canadian and British, because 1st Canadian Army was made up of British 30 Corps, British 1st Corps, and 2nd Canadian Corps at this point. The thaw that had begun was turning what tracks were available to the British and Canadians into muddy messes, and the Rhine floodplain was sodden or still completely underwater from the blown dikes that the Germans had made. The American Ninth Army, under General William H. Simpson, had been unable to launch their attack in support of Veritable, called Operation Grenade, which was meant to cross the Ruhr River and blitz up to the Rhine, because that area was so badly flooded still, they had to be waiting till it subsided. Field Marshal Montgomery, though, was pleased with the results of Operation Veritable, but General Couillard realized he needed a new deliberate plan, and an operation was needed to seek the west bank of the Rhine. He still had British 30 Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks to the south with the 51st Highland, 53rd Welsh, 15th Scottish, the Guards, and 11th Armored Divisions, and in the north, he had the 2nd Canadian Corps under Lieutenant General Guy Simons with the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions, the 4th Canadian Armored Division, and attached to them for temporarily was the 43rd Wessex Division. The plan for Operation Blockbuster was to break the last of the German defenses of the Siegfried Line in this area, clear the West Bank fully, and hopefully capture the bridge at Wesel intact. The Americans would now launch Operation Grenade at the same time, attacking over the Ruhr, clearing the West Bank, and pushing the Germans against the British and Canadians in hope to destroy them. The 2nd Canadian Plan Corps was briefed by Lieutenant General Guy Simons to his divisional commanders on the 22nd of February, 1945. Interestingly, he did not issue any written orders for this battle. It was all verbally done. Their job was to attack across the ridge in front of them, which ran from Kalkar in the north, past Udum, and then breached the defense of the Hochwald Forest. The Hochwald Gap was in fact a gap between 3 different forests, the Hochwald to the north and 2 to the south, and then with the intent to exploit it beyond to capture Xanten and then Wesel. The leading units were to be from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, now under Major General A.B. Matthews, whose 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade, Brigadier General Meagle, was on the left, just south of the Cleve-Kalkar Road. He had the Régiment de la Maisonneuve attacking from Moyland Wood, which we saw in the last battle of Operation Veritable had been a tough fight, across the Kalkar-Gach Road, and the Black Watch, crossing the road and driving towards the Kalkar-Udum Road. To their south was the 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade under Brigadier General R.H. Kiefler, who put all 3 of his battalions into the attack, contrary to traditional doctrine at the time, with the South Saskatchewan Regiment, the Fusilier Mont-Royal, and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders also attacking across the Kalkar-Gach Road and taking the Kalkar-Udum roads. He had the Fort Garry Horse and the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment from the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade under their command. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, who was south of them, commanded by Major General Dan Spry, attacked with the 8th Canadian Brigade under Brigadier Roberts, who also put all 3 of his battalions, the Queen's Own Rifles, the North Shores Regiment, and the Régiment de la Chaudière, all attacking toward the villages around and into the town of Kepelen. The 23rd of February, 1945, the long-awaited Operation Grenade began, pushing deep against the weakened German defenders who had been stripped away and moved north to hold against the Canadians during Operation Veritable. And now, for the 1st Canadian Army, would not be the only fighting formation on the entire Western Front fighting the Germans. That's one thing about Operation Veritable that people often forget when they critique it, is that no other army along the entire Western Front was attacking when the 1st Canadian Army was. The attack goes in, Blockbuster Phase 1. On the night of the 25th of February, the attacking units moved to their starting positions, which they did under artillery fire from the Germans, but somehow completed that ahead of schedule. They were facing German paratroopers with a few supporting tanks, and the Germans decided to put in a quick attack against the right side of the 2nd Canadian Division, which was at that time was being held by the 4th Canadian Infantry Division's Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. And with the help of a troop of tanks that came up from the Fort Garry Horse, they defeated the German spoiling attack, knocking out a German Panther tank. At 3:45 a.m. on the 26th of February, 1945, the artillery program began. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division attack was supported by 12 field, 6 medium, and 3 heavy regiments of artillery. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division attack had 7 field and 2 medium regiments firing their barrage. The northernmost unit, the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade, was to secure the left flank of the 2nd Canadian Corps attack. The Régiment de la Maisonneuve took 3 hamlets without much effort, but an attack by its D Company on its furthest objective was halted by heavy fire, pinning them down in place in the open fields. With no tank support available until mid-morning, the attack stalled, with the troops sitting in the field. But when the 2 troops of tanks from the 1st Canadian Hussars showed up, along with some Wasp carriers from their own regiment, they were able to finally take their objective. The Black Watch, just south of them, went in with its objective being hit by heavy fire, but its tank support got bogged down in the mud even before they started. And so Lieutenant Colonel B.R. Ritchie, the commanding officer, concentrated on taking his closest objectives. And by 10 a.m., when the tanks had finally gotten themselves free and arrived, he took his final objective, a crossroad on the Calcar Road. At 4:30 a.m., men of the 6th Canadian Brigade, all mounted, and they're the only ones mounted, in ram kangaroos, or mounted on the backs of tanks, which were supporting them, and they were mounted on the tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, raced to keep up with the barrage. The Fusilier Mont-Royal, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Jacques Dextraz, future Chief of the Defense Staff of the Canadian Forces, were on their objective at 5:10 in the morning, and the South Saskatchewans captured the high ground on the Cleve-Xanton Railway. The Cameron Highlanders of Canada, who had a 2-mile advance, quickly bogged down due to mines and mud and German fire, and by 7 a.m. had lost their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel E.P. Thompson, who was killed. Valiant efforts of Major D.M. Rogers, who commanded A Company, got the unit onto its ridge objectives. He cleared 2 houses alone, taking out the Germans defending them. He then took over the command of the battalion when he found out the CO had been killed, at the same time as leading his company onto its objective. He had his unit and all of the other companies on their objectives by the middle of the day. The 6th Brigade attack cost 140 casualties, but netted over 500 prisoners of war. So the map in this photo shows the opening phase of the attack, which is predominantly, I've talked about the 2nd Canadian Division attack, which is the northern part. North of them, and you'll see it on the map, it says 5th Wilts. That's the 43rd Wessex Division. That tank is a 1st Hussar tank that is bogged down in the mud at the start line of the attack, and they're trying to hook it up so they can tow it out. The mud in the fields were absolutely terrible. The 8th Canadian Brigade attack to the south had difficulties from the beginning, with the ground being so wet that tank support was all but impossible, and there were no kangaroos for this brigade, and so they had no way to cross the open ground, except on foot. The Queen's Own Rifles' attack against the hamlet of Mushoff by D Company was twice repulsed by the Germans, and the German counterattack had to be beaten off, but with significant casualties. The leading platoon commander was wounded, and so Sergeant Aubrey Cousins took command of the survivors, all 4 of them. He dashed across 25 yards of open fire-swept ground to a tank which had somehow come up to support them. Initially, they had been tasked to just sit back and open fire as overwatch. He calmly climbed onto the front of the tank and directed its fire against German strongpoints, and he then used it to break up a second counterattack by having it charge into the German infantry. He then organized his surviving men, all 4 of them, on and around the tank, and had them, the tank, ram the first house, where he, covered by his men, stormed in and wiped out the defenders. He then stormed a second, and followed by a third house, whose defenders quickly retreated when they were attacked. His last house was a 2-story strongpoint, which his men followed him into and cleared it, breaking the defenders of the town. He ordered his men, all 4 were still somehow alive, to consolidate, and he went to report to his company commander, but was struck down by fire as he finished his report. For his actions, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, and it was the very first Victoria Cross awarded to any member of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division of the Second World War. The photo on the very left is Sergeant Aubrey Cousins, VC of the Queen's Own Rifles, killed in action on the 26th of February. He is today commemorated at Groesbeek War Cemetery. The rest of the Queen's Own Rifles took their objectives, and 2 more strong points, which were 2 more strong-pointed hamlets north of Capelin, and by 5 p.m. the day was over. They had suffered 37 killed and 64 wounded that day. The Regiment de la Chaudière and the North Shores attacks did not begin until much later, at 8:45 a.m., well after the battle had begun. The Chaudières had B Squadron of the 1st Hussars in support, and they were to clear some hamlets on the right flank to allow the North Shore to go through the center and attack the town of Capelin. Things progressed well for the Chaudières until about 10 a.m., when fire from Capelin held them up. As B Company saw white flags of surrender, they relaxed, thinking they had won the day, only to be suddenly attacked by 3 German Panther tanks that drove them back with many, many casualties. The North Shore, who had no tank support at all, as they advanced over the open ground towards the town of Capelin, were about halfway when they began to get pinned down by enemy fire. And they had to wait for tanks from one of the other attacks to become free and support them. By the middle of the afternoon, the North Shores launched another attack, which allowed the Chaudières, who had stalled, to also clear the last of their objectives as the fire slackened against both parties. At the end of the day, the North Shores had had 16 killed and 46 wounded. The North Shore's renewed attack had 13 Sherman tanks in support, as finally freed from the mud and release of supporting fire positions from other attacks from C Squadron of the 1st Hussars. Lieutenant Colonel Rowley, the CO of the North Shores, put A Company on the back of tanks, B and C on foot, and the carrier platoon with Wasp flamethrowers, and they stormed the town of Kepelen. 3 tanks were quickly knocked out, but the Wasps burned out the German anti-tank guns. A Company, with the help of artillery support, and D Company coming in from behind them, entered and cleared the town by 5 p.m. at a cost of another 81 casualties, including 28 dead. The 1st Hussars, supporting the 2 battalions on the right-hand side of the attack, had lost 9 Sherman tanks on the day. While this was happening, the 4th Canadian Armored Division moved through the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and secured the Kalkar-Uddams Ridge's northern half in preparation to storm the Hochwald Gap, with their unit being broken into groups. The Tiger Group, which was the 4th Canadian Armored Brigade with 2 additional infantry battalions from 10th Canadian Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Monsell, who broke it down into little battle groups, with the British Columbia Regiment being tied with the Lincoln and Welland Regiment, the Canadian Grenadier Guards with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and the Governor General's Foot Guards with the Lake Superior Regiment. Plus, they had some Sherman flail tanks, Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tanks, and some self-propelled anti-tank guns in support. They cleared their objective on the ridge quickly by 4 p.m. And as a result of that, this is Private A.N. Giroux of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. He's a very young-looking man. Those are some of the prisoners that the Argylls had swept up as they moved onto the ridge. At about 6 p.m., timed with the 9th Infantry Brigade's attack on the town of Udom, the Governor General's Foot Guards and Lake Superior Regiment battle group, called Smith Force, attacked a high feature at Paulsburg, which they took and were immediately counterattacked by the Germans, which they defeated, and by 10:30 had the position around Katzburg taken and secured, with only 19 total casualties. The 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade attack on Udom used the Highland Light Infantry and the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders to secure the north end of the town, and then the North Nova Scotia Highlanders would then attack through the town. They were supposed to have tanks from the 1st Hussars, but by this time none were available, and so at 9 p.m. they went in only with artillery support. They advanced and cleared the anti-tank ditch surrounding the town and made it into the northern half by midnight, when resistance from the German paratroops suddenly increased significantly. All through the night, the fighting was confused, and by 4 a.m. on the 27th of February, it was all but over in the north, and so the North Nova Scotia Highlanders pushed through, and by 9:30 on the 27th of February, they were in the southwest corner, and finally some tanks had arrived, which helped them with some of the tougher sections, and by the end of the day, the town had been completely secured. To the very north, the borrowed 43rd Wessex Division on the very left-hand side had moved to keep up, securing the flank, and had captured the town of Kalkar, only to find all of the bridges there over the Rhine had been destroyed. Phase 2, into the Hochwald Gap. At midnight on the 26th and 27th of February, 4th Armored Brigade troops 4th Infantry Brigade troops had relieved the 4th Armored Brigade, which gets very confusing because they're both Canadian brigades with the number 4, as they prepared for the attack against what was called the Schlieffen position, a second line of defenses making up the deeper part of the Siegfried Line in this part of Germany, which is the very northern end of the Siegfried Line. The plan was to punch through the gap between the Hochwald forests and the 2 forests to the very south, hence why it's called the Hochwald Gap. At 4:30 a.m. on the 27th of February, the South Alberta Regiment and the Algonquin Regiment were staged near the hamlet of Kearsall, just north of Udom. Codenamed Lion Group, and under the command of the 10th Canadian Infantry Brigade commander, Brigadier Jefferson, they were to attack through the gap to a place called Hill, or Point 73, which is given the code name Albatross. 5th Brigade was to attack into the North Hochwald in support from the 2nd Canadian Division, and to the south, the 8th Canadian Brigade was to attack into the southern part of the Hochwald Gap called the Tuschenwald. A squadron of the South Alberta Regiment, along with the carrier platoon of the Algonquin Regiment, were detached and were to carry out a right hook attack through the town of Udemerbruch, much to the displeasure of the two commanding officers, who thought the mission was going to be a suicide mission, running deep through enemy lines. The plan of attack had all the forces advancing under the cover of darkness because of the known strength of the defenses. But the start of the attack was delayed by the late arrival of one of the companies from the Algonquin Regiment who had gotten lost. At 5 a.m., the Germans had started to bombard Kearsall. So at 5:15, Lieutenant Colonel Bradburn of the Algonquin Regiment gave the order to advance, and they quickly overran the German outposts, and by daylight, the two leading companies had crossed the anti-tank ditch, a minefield, knee-deep wire protecting the trench system, and then into the trench system. They secured the entrance to the Hochwald Gap and the last major defensive line before the Rhine. The Germans started to try to eliminate this spearhead. The 2nd Canadian Division attack in the north into the Hochwald had not made enough gains to help the men in the gap, and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division was held up around Udem, and so the southern flank was also in the air. The Germans pounded the South Alberta Regiment as they dug in and held on in the gap. And what of that right hook? Well, it had met with a complete disaster. The men of A Squadron and the carrier platoon had advanced in complete daylight, ended up in an area not yet cleared by 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade, and then drove right into a German ambush at a level crossing. The first and last tanks were suddenly knocked out as the trap sprang closed, trapping the rest of the tanks and carriers on a narrow sunken road near this train crossing. And soon the carriers and all of the tanks were hit, forcing the survivors to try to escape. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders were just coming up as the survivors, what few of them there were, broke out. But not many made it. Most were killed or captured, essentially wiping out A Squadron of the South Alberta Regiment. So that on the slide that you see now, that's the plaque and the crossing where the ambush took place. It's one of the few memorials on the battlefield to Canadians. You can go to the places and see all of these places and houses and buildings, but this is one of the very few memorials that still exists. The 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade attack against the Schlieffen position began before daylight, and by 10 a.m. had cleared the edge of the Hochwald. The Regiment de Maisonneuve and the Calgary Highlanders tried to move in too, but they were hit by German shelling, preventing the Black Watch from coming through to continue the attack. The Argyll and Southern Highlanders rejoined the 10th Brigade after their time with Tiger Force and were sent in to support the Algonquin Regiment inside of the gap. And as they closed up onto the forest gap late on the 27th, they too were hung up by shell fire about 500 yards west of the entry point in the gap. Major General Charles Vokes, commander of the 4th Canadian Armored Division, ordered the 10th Brigade to clear the gap, but part of the southern forest, and then secure a railway line running from Udem so that it could be turned into a new road. Closing this gap would allow the 4th Armored Brigade battle groups of the Grenadier Guards and Lake Superiors to advance to a point east of the gap on the rail line. Just before 3 a.m. on the 28th of February, 1945, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders advanced uphill into the gap and by daylight had captured Point or Hill 73 and were on the downward slope on the eastern side of the gap, holding all day in the face of some fierce attacks. Supported by C Squadron of the South Alberta Regiment, they were able to hold on. As the Lincoln and Welland formed up for their attack, they were caught by artillery fire, which suddenly caused 49 casualties, and they were unable to get reorganized, and so their attack was halted. The Algonquins did end up sending a company south to clear the hamlet of Udemerbruch and see if they could find any survivors from their ambush. The 4th Canadian Armored Brigade battle group was committed into the fray of the gap, but it got no further than the 10th Brigade units. Plans to move other units had to be cancelled as the tanks and kangaroos were bogged down in the mud. told to hang on until 6th Brigade arrived to replace them. The Hockwald Gap was such a brutal fight. This is a South Alberta Regiment Firefly. It's not actually what it's called. It's a Sherman 5 Mark C tank. It's got a 17-pounder gun. It was the best Allied tank of the war. As you can see, it's trying to get through the mud on the way to the gap. It just bogged them all down. The 4th Brigade in the north and the 4th Brigade attack in the northern and the 5th Brigade Infantry Brigade attack in the southern slope leading into the Hockwald were only going slightly better. The Royal Regiment of Canada had spent 2 days clearing the northern part of the start line and securing it by the 28th of February. The 1st of March was an infantry show. 4th and 5th Infantry Brigades were north of the gap. 6th Brigade replaced the 4th and 10th Brigades, 4th Armored and 10th Infantry Brigades in the gap, and 8th Brigade was finally in a position to attack into the Tuschenwald. The Essex Scottish, with tanks from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, attacked into the forest at 7:45 in the face of fierce resistance. C Company of the Essex Scottish had a new commander, 39-year-old Major F.A. Tilson, who was fighting his first action. He'd actually been in the battalion adjutant and battalion intelligence officer since landing in Normandy in July of 1944, and had been wounded once before, but had never actually been in a combat situation. Crossed 500 yards of open ground and 10 feet of wire to get into the German trenches, which they did thanks to the heroic deeds of Major Tilson, who, even though he'd been shot in the head, kept leading the attack and was the first man into the trench, knocking out a machine gun position with a grenade. He kept his men going, even though he was wounded a second time, quite severely, in the leg, and they took the next line of trenches in vicious fighting, but before they could consolidate, they were hit by a hard counterattack. Major Tilson calmly organized the defenses by moving between his platoons in the open. 6 times he crossed to a flanking company to get more ammunition, and even when he was hit by a 3rd time, shattering both of his legs, he had to pass on command, he refused evacuation. By nightfall, the badly hammered and depleted Essex Scottish were still hanging on to their gains and allowed for the follow-on units a chance to clear into the wood. It had cost the Essex Scottish 31 killed and 77 wounded. Major Tilson would lose both of his legs, but his actions would lead him to being awarded the Victoria Cross, the only one in the Northwest Europe campaign for the 2nd Canadian Division, and the 3rd for that division in the entire war. The first 2 happening at Dieppe. Major Tilson also, because of his previous injury, lost the sight in one of his eyes as well. So the top photo is Major Frederick Albert Tilson, VC of the Essex Scottish Regiment. That's a photo of him as a captain just outside of Caen, just after they'd arrived in July of 1944. The bottom left-hand photo, that's the Hockwald Forest objective taken from their start line. So they had to cross that entirely open field, and those little trees you see in the distance, that was their objective. If you look at the top photo, that's some of the wire that he and his men had to attack through to get into the forest behind it. And the anti-tank position, he actually knocked out. That was one of the ones that he actually knocked out. Was one of the part of the actions that led him to be awarded the Victoria Cross. The 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade attack on the woods south of the Gap got nowhere on the 1st of March. The Chaudières attacked in the evening, only to be thrown back by heavy German fire. They tried again early on the 2nd of March with some tanks from the 1st Hussars, which got them through the Tuschenwald, allowing at 2:30 p.m. the North Shores and the Queen's Own to pass through and tackle the larger and much more difficult Baldberger Wald, the other half of the Hockwald Gap forests. The 2nd of March, in fact, had the entire 2nd Canadian Corps in action. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division's 4th Brigade had the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry relieve the battered and destroyed Essex Scottish in the Hockwald and push 500 yards along the road to the town of Marienbaum. The 4th Armored Brigade was given the Algonquin Regiment to help break out east. In a complicated plan, the Lake Superior Regiment, now in kangaroos and not their normal half-tracks, with tanks from the Canadian Grenadier Guards, were to attack east to the end of the Gap, Hockwald Gap, and capture the road between Marienbaum and the town of Sonsbeck. The Governor General's foot guards, carrying other Algonquins, would then pass through and capture another stream about 100 yards past called the Low Hay. All was supposed to happen in the darkness. Well, what actually happened was the sodden and muddy ground delayed the arrival of the kangaroos. So instead of attacking at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night and in the dark, it was 4:30 in the morning when the Lake Superiors and the Grenadier Guards charged down the slope at the far end of the Hochwald Gap. The commanding officer of the Lake Superior Regiment had just returned from leave and had tried to postpone the attack because he saw the shattered and tired state of his men, but was ordered to go forward anyways, which they did through heavy German fire. They made their first target, some houses, but when the tanks started getting hit from anti-tank guns and some Tiger tanks that were hiding south, Lake Superior Scottish Sea Company were the only ones to make it to the final objective, only to be pinned down. The Algonquins tried to come up and support them, but lost 5 of the 8 tanks supporting them in their desperate attempt to save the Lake Superiors. All attempts to get to the stream had failed, and by 8 a.m., all the tanks had to pull back, leaving all the infantry exposed and alone. German counterattacks hammered at the Algonquins, and an erroneous message sent up the chain of command had said they were at the stream, and the remaining of the Algonquin companies tried to reach them, but both A and C Company failed. By late afternoon, a lone survivor of D Company brought the news that it had been overrun by tanks and infantry. Lake Superior C Company, the company that had been trapped, also suffered the same fate, with only 8 of the 44 men who made the attack making it back to Canadian lines. This attempt by the 4th Canadian Armored Division had failed, and early on the 3rd of March, the worn units were pulled out and replaced by the even equally tired units of the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade from 2nd Division. In total, in this part of the battle, the Algonquins had lost 87 men, including 32 prisoners of war, and the Lake Superior 53, which 16 of their men were captured. The 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade was fighting in the Hochwald now, and while this was going on, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders stopped about 500 yards short of their objective at the southeastern end of the Hochwald, preventing the Fusiliers-Mont-Royal or the South Saskatchewans to follow through. It took 5th Brigade coming into the gap on the 3rd of March before units of the 6th Brigade could get moving in the woods again, and then 4th Brigade in the northern end, making it to the far eastern edge of the forest. 8th Canadian Brigade units in the south took 2 more days to clear the Waldberger Wald, but it faced small parties resisting to the bitter end and vicious counterattacks. 100 casualties were suffered by this time in the Waldberger Wald before the battle there ended. The German defenses break. The night of the 3rd and 4th of March came the first break in the German defenses. The withdrawal of German units forced them to pull back several kilometers east of the Hochwald. The 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade was thus able to finish clearing the Hochwald forest, and the attack by the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade out of the gap found no Germans in their path, finding only destroyed enemy equipment and enemy dead. The next phase for the 2nd Canadian Division was to regroup for their planned attack on Xanten. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had to finish clearing the Waldberger Wald and then open a route to the town of Sonsbeck, so 4th Canadian Infantry Division was able to advance through them and take the town of Wien. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division's 9th Brigade, which had not been heavily engaged in a while, cleared the last of the forest, and by the 6th of March, allowed the 7th Brigade to come forward with the Canadian Scottish to attack Sonsbeck, which it did, and they passed through by the Regina Rifles, who only met moderate resistance in the town, and they linked up with the 30 Corps' 3rd British Infantry Division, about a mile south of the town. Second Canadian Division moved up to within 2 miles of Xanten on the 5th of March. 6th Brigade was to attack the town itself the next day, and the 5th Brigade to capture the high ground southeast of the town. The attack by the Cameron Highlanders was repulsed early on the 6th of March, and so an attack by the 4th and 5th Brigades together was organized under a surprising code name Blockbuster 2, which was planned to take place on the 8th of March. At 5:30 a.m. on the 8th of March, the barrage began, and 15 minutes later, in the pouring rain, the Essex Scottish and Royal Hamilton Light Infantry attacked with tanks from the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment, making good progress initially. By 7:30, they were being slowed down, but then they brought forward Churchill Crocodile flamethrowing tanks, and they burned the German defenders out. By midday, the Essex were on the line just outside of the town. To their right, the Hamilton Light Infantry were having a tougher time when their leading companies were attacked from behind and then a large crater held up with supporting tanks and carriers. The commanders of both A and B Company of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry became casualties, and the D Company commander was captured when his company was cut off and overrun. To help ease the situation, the Royal Regiment of Canada was brought into the battle with some extra Wasp flamethrowers in support, and they got to the outskirts of town by the end of the day, and they made contact with the 43rd Wessex Division in the very northern outskirts of the village. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry were still struggling, and so the 5th Brigade was then brought forward. The Regiment de Maisonneuve drove into Xanten from the north in kangaroos, and at 10:45 p.m., without meeting any resistance, they were soon smashing through the town. The Black Watch were on foot and secured the area behind them. The South Saskatchewan were attached to the same brigade and continued the attack to the southern edge of the forest just outside of Xanten, and the Calgary Highlanders moved to secure the far end. It was now daylight on the 9th of March, and the Regiment de Maisonneuve passed through the Black Watch, leapfrogging a second time to secure the crossings over the Weinthaler Canal with the help from the tanks from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers again. This allowed the Calgary Highlanders to actually cross the canal later that night. The actions around Xanten was costly, with 400 casualties suffered by the 2nd Canadian Division, with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Essex Scottish suffering the worst, another 134 and 108 casualties respectively. If you actually add up the casualties, the Essex Scottish Regiment lost about half its strength in this battle. German resistance was not really fading in this area, even though they were badly losing, and the 4th Canadian Armored Division's attack towards Rhin on the 6th of March, when a company from the Argyll and Southern Highlanders got into the town, they were cut off and overrun. It would take a 2-battle group attack the next day to finally capture the town. By the 8th of March, the units were pinned down and stuck again by fire and mud. The Germans withdrew from the town that night, and so on the 9th, Rhin was finally captured completely. The Canadians continued to move towards the village of Weinthal, which the Lake Superior Regiment attacked with the help from the Canadian Grenadier Guards, who were unable to keep up due to mines and mud, but were able to fire the Lake Superiors into the town, which they were able to capture by the morning of the 10th of March. The cost to the 4th Canadian Armored Division was absolutely terrible. The Algonquins in this battle and attacks lost 141 men, the Lincoln Welland 101, and the Argylls 69 for the fighting for Rhin and Weinthal. This was the last action of the 4th Canadian Armored Division west of the Rhine. So the photos in this one is this stage of the fighting. So 6th Anti-Tank Regiment was a mixed unit of self-propelled and towed 17-pounder anti-tank guns, which are these big, beastly, and probably the best anti-tank gun of the war. And that is one of the gunners inspecting their handiwork. They knocked out what's called a Jagdpanther. It had a big 88mm gun stuck into a casemate on a Panther chassis. Mechanically very unreliable and very weak side armor, had incredibly strong frontal armor and a good gun, but this one got knocked out by 6th AT Regiment, Royal Canadian Artillery. Men of the Queen's Own Cameron Highlander, if you can see in the photo, they're actually holding German Reichsmarks. They are just outside of a bank in Xanten, just after the capture of the town. You'll notice that some of them have shovels stuffed into their webbing. The issue entrenching tool was less than popular, and so British soldiers often would carry shovels and picks instead of the hasty entrenching tool. The bottom left photo is the men of the Argyll and Southerners warming themselves in Rhin after its capture. That unit had had a really tough battle, and most of its actions in the war, it was quite a strong unit, but this one really beat up the unit pretty hard, and it was a cold, wet fight. The other one is one of the anti-tank guns from, it's believed to be 6th Anti-Tank Regiment, moving up through the Hochwald to support 2nd Canadian Infantry Division's attack on Xanten. And it carried normally a 17-pounder anti-tank gun on a tank-like chassis that was lightly armored. Operation Blockbuster had been the hardest and worst fighting in Northwest Europe's campaign. Not only had the Canadians fought over in and some of the worst ground, they also did so in the dead of winter. Operation Blockbuster, as I said earlier, was the first action where Canadians conscripts fought in the Second World War. And while 16,000 did make it to Europe, only about 2,200 totally made it to the front, and only 69 of those were actually killed from the end of February until the 8th of May, 1945. And they were the reason why we were able to keep fighting, as we had these conscripts coming in, and we were able to release more and more men from training. The total casualties for Operation Veritable and Operation Blockbuster for the 2nd Canadian Corps were 379 officers and 4,925 other ranks. And that's from the 8th of February to the 10th of March, 1945, with the worst being suffered during Operation Blockbuster, of which 243 officers and 3,395 men were killed or became casualties. Sorry. By now, the stage was set for the crossing of the Rhine. The 1st Canadian Army had no direct role to play in what was to become Operation Varsity and Plunder, but the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, part of the 6th Airborne Division, did, and we're going to talk about them next month. Yeah, our next talk is talking about Operation Plunder and Varsity, and then we're going to talk about the Liberation Campaign in the Netherlands after that, 1st and 2nd Canadian Corps operations, which is, we're going to actually finish the Second World War on time this time.
I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today or joining us online. And I'd like to thank Rob. Thank you for passionately informing us and giving us all the best tips and tricks for a battlefield tour trip. We always appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So I would, if I were you, I'm leaving it in the chat, but Tuesday, March 11th at 7 p.m. Berlin, same time next month. Keep an eye out on your March mid-month bulletins and calendars to catch the next battlefield tour with Rob Woolsey. And as he mentioned, we will be talking about the crossing of the Rhine, Operation Varsity and Plunder, part 3 of this battle. So we hope to see you there, and have a great day, everyone.
Have a great night, everybody. Thank you very much.